And thank you to all of you for being here. I see many people, 80% are friends, so I cannot say that I'm very recognized. And thank you for being here again with the presentation that most of you probably have seen before, or the idea or discuss many of those concepts. Among the persons that are here today are many of the colleagues that uh, with them we discuss, we created, we change many of our understanding of what means the search and the identification today. And we are learning together, persons from different contexts, different continents that have similar situations and similar challenges, and with whom we are trying to understand better how to have a best practice from our different disciplines. It's not based on forensic anthropology. This talk is based more in the process of identification, in the challenges, in how we change our mind after 20 years, 30 years, working in the search and the identification of missing persons in different contexts, but always in complex scenarios because of many different factors. So after this, I will try to do this in 45 minutes, and I will share a presentation. Please tell me if you can see the screen because I cannot see any of you.
Sí, sí se ve.
And okay.
Sí.
So this talk, thanks to Panacea's invitation, is called Challenges in Identifying Missing Persons in Complex Scenarios. We have here persons coming from different background, different disciplines that are trying to work in this identification process from different perspective or disciplines. And we all know that the missing persons situation is a general problem in the world. It's not a new process. And also the need for identifying remains, or also persons that has to prove, living persons, in the need to prove identity, is a general problem in many different countries in the world. So we all know, part of us are scientists. We know that science, even if has limitations, or even if is advancing in many other disciplines, always or traditionally help or assist in the search for these missing persons. So if we look behind 25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when my organization started in the search and identification of missing persons because of political violence, of course, today we have technological advances. We have technologies, techniques that were unbelievable, unthinkable 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. We have new disciplines, new concepts that were not considered even, well, forensic in a moment, or they were not considered useful in the search or identification of missing persons. We were discussing the needs for years of multidisciplinarity, how the forensic specialist, the pathologist, or the forensic doctor or physician is not working, or is not in the need to work alone today, but the need for these multidisciplinary teams. But now we go one step forward and we talk about interdisciplinarity, because it is important not only to have different disciplines working together in a case, it is necessary the joint analysis of the information to reach this unique conclusion among different disciplines. So just because there are different disciplines, it doesn't mean that it will be integrated the conclusion, it will be integrated the analysis. And this is the next step that, at least from my side, I am understanding now that multidisciplinarity is not enough. We need interdisciplinarity. And this integrated approach in the investigation that I will try to develop. And the understanding that this was, I think, the main aspect that we learn is that investigation and identification is a process. It's not just the application of different techniques, as we will see. So, in the last years, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were writing to colleagues to ask for specific questions that were not in the literature, that were not published, what to do with this profile, what to do if I have an inconsistency in a kinship when I do a comparison with the profile of a body. Fortunately, in the last years, there are many different guidelines, manuals, recommendation of best practices, minimum standards, where we can at least refer. This is much more than we had at years ago. Among those, I will not be very explicit, but among those, I want to highlight this. This was the first one in our case where grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, the Argentine forensic anthropology team, make a request to the Argentine state, who make a request to UN to establish some protocols or establish some guidelines or recommendation for the use of forensic genetics in investigations in cases, yeah, of human rights and humanitarian international law violations. After this is old today, but after this, many other guidelines are helping us to understand better our discipline, how understand better the documentation of the necessary evidence that we have to present to prove an identification. It doesn't matter the framework, if it's a criminal investigation or if it's a humanitarian case without prosecution or accountability. We have a renovated or new Istanbul Protocol for the documentation of torture. There are beautiful principles in the guiding principles for the search for disappeared persons in the Committee of Enforced Disappearances. I recommend you to read this because there are some technical principles, some legal principles, and many ethical principles. The General Assembly in United Nations also are giving guidelines or are giving recommendations for the best practices or effective investigation of these enforced disappearances. Many years ago, in the ICRC Forensic Advisory Board, it was a meeting where well, the conclusion was that we were very old in our concepts and in our recommendations in general. So it was necessary what to update the old manuals or to create some new concepts. That's why a big group of colleagues, among them there are many persons here present today. First step, we publish this article in Forensic Science International about the search process, giving some different approach, different uh, concept of what means the search in capital letters, what means the identification of the missing and unidentified persons. This part of this article, that is an open source, was after collected in the new 2022 guideline on forensic human identification process from the ICRC. So going to the point, we know that we will try to identify, to search for unidentified persons in different type of cases or different type of contexts, in common crimes, human rights violations, armed conflict, mass disaster, feminicide, migrant context of migration, and that is possible that we will apply or use the same techniques, but the context will be different. And we need to adapt, not to improvise what we will do, but we will need to adapt our practice also to the type of context. So there are pictures that are showing clear criminalistic scene, but where search how to identify persons where we have more complex scenarios, where we don't have a scene, we don't have documentation, we don't have any other thing than testimonies, memory of the witnesses who know where these persons can be, memory of relatives who knows the information that we need on the missing person, what to do when we have mass disasters, not a close case like an airplane crash, but more open, big mass disaster or conflicts where there are many times open cases, and we really need to reinforce our structures, our investigative capacity, and investigation is the base for the identification process. An investigation, it doesn't mean that it's a criminal investigation. It can be an investigation in a humanitarian framework, but is the base for us to try to track the missing persons, to try to know what happened, and to try to find them and identify them, even if they are alive or they are dead. Context of migration, international or national displacement that in the last years is many years now, unfortunately, is explosive, and we have to find really challenging context to try to identify the missing or the disappeared. And we are not talking about dead persons anymore. We are talking about any kind of condition, living persons that had to be identified because they were in detention centers, living persons that are unaccompanied, minors in displacement, in migration, living persons that because of a reason have to prove identity again. So forensics is beyond the death. Forensic is much more than this, and we have to approach to this in the broad sense. Forensics is what will help us to answer the same questions even if the person is alive or is dead. So what considerations regarding the search process, and we have to talk a bit about the search to understand why the identification is part of this. The first thing is what means the search, and this is what we were discussing. And the search is not only the recovery of remains or the management of the death, is much more than this. It's all the combination of processes that will try to determine basically two questions: fate and whereabouts. And this is part of international humanitarian law: fate and whereabouts of a person. What means whereabout? The circumstances of the case, the context, the parcours or journey, the circuit of these persons from the moment, since the moment that it was last seen until the moment that the person is found, the causes, the location, of course, of the person. And this is 100% part of investigation. It doesn't matter the framework. And what means fate? Fate is just the condition of the person, the state, alive or death of the person. And this is 100% related with identification. But we cannot separate identification from investigation because identification is part of the search. So the search of missing persons consists in reconstructing, always in retrospect, from today to yesterday, what happened with this person, and to try to clarify with certainty the fate and the whereabouts of the person. Of course, identification process is just one part of this overarching concept of search, and directly related and dependent. So we cannot, as I said, separate this. In this investigation, in this search, in which identification process is included. We have to reconstruct what happened. We have an empty vacuum, a dark room in the middle that we will have to fill out with information to reconstruct what happened, to give information to the families, to give information to the authorities, and to have elements to identify and to find first and identify after these persons from the events to the finding. And the finding can be death or it can be alive. We cannot talk anymore only about dead bodies. So this search is investigative. Human identification is just one part of this. And forensic sciences are a useful tool to support the effective search process for the missing, for the disappeared, and for the unidentified persons. Other considerations is that, of course, only the clarification of the fate to know if the person is alive or dead does not fulfill the requirements of the right to know in the relatives. And we know that because we are all persons. If we have a relative who disappear or who die, we want to know first if he's alive or dead. And if he's dead, we need to know what happened. And if he's alive also, but if he's dead, we need to know what happened. We need information about whereabouts. This is part of the right to know, recognized in many of the international laws. So all this retrospective reconstruction of circumstances is essential, not only in the identification, but also in the right to know for the families that will be incomplete if we only say, okay, is death, this is the body, we can prove with this and this technique. It does not give enough information for them. So in the search, in the identification process, we will have to follow some principles. Clearly, uncertainty. We need to assess the reliability and certainty of this identification. We have to prove our hypothesis. We have to document properly. We have principles of legality, legitimacy, credibility, and integrality that we have to fulfill. The investigation is also a process. And try to get information on the two legs in the search process, fate and whereabouts. We need to answer what happened, how happened, who is involved, victims, many times also perpetrators, even in a humanitarian framework is important because many times is leading to a line of investigation to search for unidentified persons. When this happened, where and why. Our investigation and the success in the possibility of identification of these persons will depend on many factors, will depend on the complexity of the case, of course, it will depend on the feasibility. Sometimes simple cases are not possible because there is no guarantees on security, there is no access to the area, there is many different reasons or remains were destroyed and it's totally clear that we will be not able to recover anymore. So we have also to assess before starting with our planning in the investigation, the complexity, feasibility, and the importance of the approach, the importance of this integrated approach from the beginning of the investigation. When we go to complex cases, not maybe to the routine cases every day, but to large scale investigations into the missing, there are many different factors that will have impact in the possibilities of identification. The scenario, closed scenarios, open scenarios, do we have at least a clue on the list of possible victims or the partial list of victims or not? The scale, the number of missing persons, the diversity, it is a very homogeneous group when we have to identify soldiers in a conflict that are more homogeneous in the biological profile, much more than a massacre where they are represented different uh, age, different sex, different status, much more diverse, the group that make a bit easier to individualize the different persons. The factors like displacement of or dispersion of population, the type of case, again, the condition of human remain, degradation, bodies are fresh, skeletonized, badly decomposed, they are burned, they are commingled or not. The moment, yeah, in which this happened is not the same to investigate cases 80 years after, like in Spain, than when they are happening at that moment. It's very different, the approach and the visibility also, the status of the person. The status is a dynamic concept. The person can be missing after it can be proven that it was a victim of enforced disappearance, after the person can be maybe found and identified, it will be death. And maybe even after identification, it will help potentially to identify other persons that have relation with this, with him or her for any reason. Mobility, geographical temporal changes, and this feasibility is part of the assessment that we really need to know. The availability of forensic specialties, the availability of protocols, the needs to adapt these protocols for these, all these factors that we were mentioning, the infrastructure, the experience that this group can have before, what will have or what will be the inter and intra-institutional coordination, the relation with authorities, the mandates, the legal framework, etc. So one of the main factors that will add complexity to our identification process will be the scale or magnitude, the number of missing and deceased persons. And of course, it's not the same to look for Wally when he's disappeared alone and is one case, that when is a group or is a big group or is a major displacement of population beyond borders. The complexity will be not the same at all. So our capacity will be challenged really with complex cases. So large scale investigation and identification system will require different approach than common deaths. We know that. Yeah. And the search and the identification process, we really need the follow-up and traceability of the missing person within a framework of a dynamic investigation. It's not something that is frozen in time. It's something that it will be changing because new lines of evidence, new lines of investigation will be open, and many times we have to modify our approach even in depending on the particularities of the case. 40 years ago, the my team developed, after it was applied in many other contexts, uh, what we call today integrated model of investigation, including the steps, different steps that are not like small boxes that don't communicate. Many times, many of them happen at the same time, but it has to have no different phases, but different components. Investigation, how we recover, how we collect the information on the case, the context information, the information on the missing, and not only the medical, then physical information, but also the social, political information that will help us also to understand lines of investigation. The recovery or the finding of the person, examination of the unidentified person, we don't talk about body only, and of course the analysis of the information, because the collection and documentation is extremely important, but is not everything. We need to analyze the information. We need to manage information management systems that are much more than a database, relationships, patterns. We need to talk about other disciplines, about complex models, mathematical models, algorithms, network analysis to understand the case better. So the search and the identification process, in my understanding today, has to be interdisciplinary, not only multidisciplinary, comprehensive, holistic, and integrated. And the approach not only should be centered in the finding and recovery of the body or the remains, because this is, we are much more than this. The complexity in the need for identification of missing persons is much broader than this. We have context of migration, documented identification of bodies without a body. So we can be quite uh, reliable in our conclusion without a body, but to understand very well the whereabouts. So consideration regarding the identification process, the first for me is to understand the levels in which the identification is concluded and formalized. We are at the technical level. We are providing all our knowledge investigative in the different techniques that we can apply in the different disciplines that we can include in our investigation. But we will reach a conclusion at the technical level, and we will provide this report or this information to the authorities to proceed with the legal identification. The person needs to be legally identified. It doesn't matter if he's dead or is alive. And the administrative formalization of this registration. In all this process, many times there are bottlenecks or there are what we can call administrative disappearances, because a person can be technically identified, but we can lose the tracking of the body, where the body was buried. We can send our report to the legal authorities, and the legal authorities can accept or not, or delay, or just ignore our report, so it can be stopped there, or it can be legally identified but never registered into the system, so the person still continue disappear or missing. So we have to understand also identification in the administrative needs, not only in the technical needs, and who has the mandate. Many times there are disputes, the law is not very clear. Who has the mandate of the technical identification? Is the police? Is the medical legal institute? Is the forensic pathologist who has to sign the final report? Or the forensic doctor is only for assessment of the cause and circumstances of the death, and the police will identify technically the person. So understanding the context, understanding the system is basic also to improve the identification system. And it's not only that level. So after the technical and legal and administrative identification, that is the initial act of recognition, this identification has to be accepted by the family, and it's a subjective process when the family will decide to accept or not. Our analysis can be perfect, our investigation can be perfect. We can produce the best forensic report, the legal authorities proceed with the identification being registered in the administrative system, but the family do not recognize because of many different factors. So how we give back the information to the family, how we inform the families, we notify, will also help in the identification process, because the family has to right to believe or not. If the family don't believe, they will continue asking again to the legal authorities to confirm this identification. And also there is a social level, the collective recognition of the missing and the identification. And many times society is a bit perverse and rumor can affect families that can doubt about the identification and can come back again to the legal authorities to confirm this and to come back to the technical. We suffer this in many contexts with where at the social level, the rumor, the perversity also is creating this fake appearance of non-credibility for this identification that will return again. So credibility, legality, and legitimacy are part of the identification process. The final decision in this identification process, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, should be conclusive. Identification, exclusion, or inconclusive. What that means? We can prove that an unidentified body, we can say to make easy, is identified. We can reach this conclusion with certainty. So we can proceed with the identification. We can also reach the conclusion that is a clear exclusion of the initial hypothesis. And we can produce also a unified conclusion that this body cannot be this missing person. But many times the results are inconclusive because we don't have enough information, because we don't have enough capacity for some techniques, and it will be inconclusive. But these partial categories are not recommended: presumptive, circumstantial, probable, possible, positive. A positive identification, meaning identification, versus a possible identification, meaning I don't know what, is not clear for anyone. It should not be clear for the family. It should not be clear for the legal system to proceed with this. Or the person is, or it is not, or we cannot prove. And we are all blessed and cursed by the different programs, books, shows, television, and also for the concept of DNA coming since basically in the last 20 years, this DNA fever that make us believe that there is a machine who can read the soil and tell us if there is a body there and even see the position and even see 3D. Or we can believe that we will take one hair of one person, put in a machine, and immediately have a match with a person with a picture without any other reconciliation of information. So those techniques, and that are wonderful, many of them, but taken to the uh, what to the reconstruction in our minds of the possibilities, yeah, make us to change our mind, the paradigm in identification from the uniqueness as it was before, or as it is in many techniques. We have fingerprints, odontology, frontal sinuses, where we compare and we say beyond reasonable doubt. We cannot uh, have any kind of quantification in fingerprints, yes, not in probability, but in many of them, we say, okay, we look for uniqueness. It is a perfect match. We change our mind, especially with after the genetic technique, for reliability, confidence level, probabilities, the quantification of the uniqueness is much credible psychologically for many of us to believe in a 99.999%, even if we don't know how this number was built, if it's correct, this calculation, if the database was correct, if we are applying correctly the prior odds calculations, then if I say, no, no, it's a perfect match. It's a perfect match according to whom? To you. And who are you? You have to explain, "No, I'm an expert and I know this." And you have to prove 1,000 times this. If I say 99.999, then not too many people will ask. Many of them will say, wow. So this change in the paradigm, in the identification, that is coming from this decision theory and basically the Bayesian analysis, is something that for us, I think is a mathematical challenge. How to improve this possibility of this decision theory with non-genetic variables. And this is the second part of this talk. This is a genetic profile of a deceased person compared with a genetic profile from a relative. This is the kinship analysis. In the kinship analysis, we don't say any only there is a match, and a match means identification. We need to proceed with calculations, mathematical calculations. We need to know if this match is real or this match can be just because of random, because there is a limited amount of genetic markers in the population, and of course, you can have this random or adventitious match. So the genetic technique, what did? It was able to apply Bayesian analysis to say, okay, I will apply different factors about the frequency of these traits in the general population, and I will, based on the frequency, I will calculate how, what is the power of individualization of this person. I have a measure that can basically, through this match, calculate something called likelihood ratio, who assess the goodness of two competing statistical models. This is the likelihood ratio, horrible, super useful, that compare basically, I have a match between a body and a mother of a missing person. What that means is the person or not. Well, we apply the algorithm, we obtain the likelihood ratio, who is telling us if the power of the hypothesis that the sample belongs to the missing person, the chances in favor of the missing person identification against the other hypothesis, the sample belongs to a person among the general population and is just a random match. We can say the chances against the missing person identification. This is wonderful, but we need to know that also the strength of this likelihood ratio, or the strength, not the likelihood ratio because we cannot modify it, but the strength of our final percentage, if we want to know if it's 99 or 97%, also depends on the number of possible victims. It doesn't depend only on genetic information. Depends on the value of the prior odds. And the prior odds is just the consideration of how many missing persons could be possible for this body through investigation. And this is based on non-genetic information. And that's very logical. It's not the same to say, okay, I have a match between a body and the mother when I have an accident in the street than when I have a tsunami with 200,000 persons. It cannot be the same. The probability to find a random match is bigger when we have more missing persons than when the number is very little. So how to combine these prior odds that is coming from investigation, non-genetic information, plus the likelihood ratio that is coming from the pure genetic algorithm is what we have to do. Yeah, in the final percentage, if we want a posterior probability of this match in using genetic techniques in a and identification process. So just to finish with this, the identification, the impact of the number of victims in identification is huge. The identification threshold that we want to reach, the 99.9 that we want to reach in the comparison of genetic profiles between the unidentified person and the relatives or the sample of the person when it was alive, it will be, imagine how the same likelihood ratio, the meaning of the posterior, the strength of the posterior probability is much less when the number of victims is bigger. So in the identification process, we need to include investigation. Even mathematically, we are we are forced to use this investigation in the quantification of the certainty of a match. So DNA is wonderful, has limitations, as any other techniques. And the missing person data collection is mandatory, yeah, in order to compare the unidentified persons and the bodies. Because to identify is to compare. We cannot identify without comparing two sets of information. If I ask you to identify or recognize this monument, probably more than 99.9 of you cannot identify this. Probably you cannot identify this. But when I show you this picture, most of you will recognize or identify this monument. Why? Because you have the information already in your database, in your brain. You have the information that this monument is called Tour Eiffel, that is in Paris, and is already in your database. This happened exactly with the identification process. We cannot recognize, we cannot identify if we don't have information to compare with. And we were talking in the class concepts about two sets of information. The ante-mortem information coming from the missing person, the post-mortem information coming from the dead body. We had a comparison, we had an hypothesis of identity that we need to verify through different techniques, medical, odontological, radiological, or genetic. This is even in many of national law or many of the internal codes in countries that is mandatory to verify with specific techniques. After all this time, we started to understand many things. That first, not all missing persons are found dead, because many people is found, not too many unfortunately, but some of them are found alive. So antemortem, especially when there are recent conflicts, when there are contexts of migration, when is displacement, is not a term to be used to refer to them because means before death. So using our antemortem file or antemortem information, going to a relative to ask for antemortem questionnaire means that we know the person is dead or that the possibility to be dead is very high. And this is sometimes insulting even for families. So what can we do to change our mind and to find another term? And also, not all unidentified persons are dead bodies. So the postmortem is very short. Of course, if I have a dead body in front of me, I can talk about postmortem. But as a generic, it can be an living unidentified person. So as a generic is also very limited. So we started to look for other possibilities instead of antemortem data, missing person data probably is much more adequate. Instead of postmortem data, as a general term, not only when we have a dead body, as I said, to use something like unidentified person data. And we have missing persons and unidentified persons, alive or dead. And we need to be in the middle. All of them have information, how to collect this information, how to document this information, and how to reconcile this in the middle is what means the identification process. So from this ante-mortem, post-mortem, creating an hypothesis of identity, verifying with 4 or 5 techniques, we started to discuss other type of approach and not talk about the technique or the combination of primary and secondary methods as before, but start talking about lines of evidence. Lines of evidence that means independent comparable data from different sources of information that will help to confirm or reject a conclusion reached in the identification process. So these lines of evidence, these little pieces of information coming from a match in odontology, in fingerprints, in genetics, in some pathology that we can find, in the document that we found associated with the clothing or facial recognition or the tattoo or the personal belongings, the clothing, the biological profile, all the information coming from this will be little pieces of comparable information. That means lines of evidence. Of course, you see small dots and big dots. And this is because of the weight in the power of individualization is not the same. Of course, it cannot be the same. The power of discrimination in the good sense, meaning individualization of a genetic match or a fingerprint match, that a match just in the biological profile or a match in the clothing, when the clothing maybe we need to know what happened with the person, if what is inside this clothing is exactly what we are expecting. So the weight, meaning the identification power or the individualization power, will be very different depending on the little piece of information. But not per se, any of them are mandatory because will depends on the type of case, on the complexity of the case also that we can identify with less or more lines of evidence. If I show you this picture of this person, I can have 1, 2, 3 lines of evidence. I am going forward, moving forward in my investigation. This is stronger, more power of discrimination because looks like an arm, looks like a human being. But I need to add, I cannot identify this person. This line of evidence is giving me much more information than others. This will have more discrimination power. Looks like something Argentinian, something related with football, but I need to continue and to continue. So the power of the different lines is different, but I have to combine all of them to really reach certainty beyond reasonable doubt. So the search and identification process of missing persons should be based on the combination and comprehensive consideration of various lines of evidence and not identification techniques. Stop talking about techniques and start talking about really evidence that can prove an identification. And I mean, this is not my idea. As I said, we were a group of persons thinking on this, but much before this, in 2011, the General Assembly of United Nations say identification should not be based only on DNA analysis or on any other primary method alone, but should take into account all available ante-mortem and post-mortem data. And reconciliation of information is basic in the identification process. So we have lines of evidence coming from the context of the case, from the place where the person was missing or the place where the unidentified person was found, dates, the grave, maybe that was uh, that was appointed by a witness, the biological profile, the dental comparison, the genetic profile, as many lines of evidence we need to prove the uniqueness of this identification. So the identification finally should be the compatibility of the missing person and unidentified person information. but also not only needs to be compatible, we need also the absence of fundamental or these contradictions that will indicate an exclusion of the possibility. And also we need consistent, unique, stable data. It has to be compatible, it has to be strong, it has to be not contradictory in any of the lines of evidence. Of course, there are some explainable, but it should not be contradictory in any of the fundamental lines of evidence. So our comprehensive analysis, you see that our lines now are not, or our flow is not linear anymore. We are making more circles in the last years. The comprehensive analysis and comparison of all the information relevant to a case should lead to the compatibility or discrepancy of comparative data concerning the missing person and the unidentified person. Consider the weight or the individualizing power of each line of evidence according to investigative technical criteria, and also the decision and next steps in terms of identification, exclusion, or in conclusion, and more investigation is required. So we have limitations on the measure of statistical certainty of each line of evidence and its combination, except for genetic analysis. Really, we cannot move beyond this certainty or statistical measure of the confidence in our conclusion. So today, there are many different groups that are trying to create or calculate a likelihood ratio for physical, medical, dental variables, Bayesian probability models, many different mathematical models to try to combine the different genetic and non-genetic information to reach a number that can help us with the decision. I don't say percentage of probability, but at least a measure of certainty. What we know is that the identification is a process and is not the result of a specific technique, that is a dynamic process more than a result. That we learn needs to be really reconcile in the middle, in the integrated reconciliation process, all the information in the investigation, all information coming from the forensic examination of the living or the dead should be reconciled in the middle, and it has to be circles. Many uh, disciplines now are providing the power of artificial intelligence, different algorithms, different mathematical models to help us to visualize and to measure the power of connection or the power of discrimination of different things. Connection network analysis that we are applying. This is network analysis applied to clandestine detention centers in Argentina, visualization tools that are super strong to try to analyze the information and try to create lines of investigation, also to locate and to track the possible places where we can find the missing persons, links, GIS, pattern analysis that we can do thanks to different softwares where we also have limitations, and we need better tools also to do not do it manually, but to help us also with different algorithms to visualize what we are not able to see. This is a map of different missing persons in Argentina during the dictatorship. We cannot see connection just in a database, in an Excel file, in different records. When we apply complex network, we understand that there are groups of persons, clusters that are connected with these persons that are connected, if we find one of them, it can lead to find the others. So social life, political life of the person, connections are extremely important in the collection of the missing person information, not only the medical, physical, odontological. This is also basic. We can apply different models. Those are Bayesian statistical models applied to missing persons in Argentina, where we can understand if there is a pattern in the disappearance of a group and on which variables, if they are depending on geotemporal variables, it depends on the political activists, it depends on the armed group that can separate the random from the pattern that will indicate us that we have to filter the group of the universe of missing persons in Argentina and focus in a group disappear in an area in certain period. And this is 100% made by physics, like Ines Caridi, that she is a physic, or mathematicians. And that can give us a prioritization at least. It will be not a probability through investigation, not yet, but at least it can be prior probability that we can combine also with the likelihood ratio in genetics, and will also help us to make a priority in the search for more information with families. Understanding mobility, the investigation is not frozen, as I said. We have to understand how the modus operandi was modified, was changing to understand, to visualize, and to present to the others. So all persons now working this uh, in this I don't know how to say it. I don't want to say only artificial intelligence, but using different specialities in informatics can help us to understand mobility, to understand the reconstruction. This was made with forensic architecture. We never thought in architecture as forensic 20 years ago. Now they are super useful. And we can also reconstruct how the group of persons who disappear were moving, where they were finally kidnapped. And this not only to understand for us and to increase the success in the possible search and the possible identification process, but also because we need to give this information back to the families, because families have the right to know what happened, the right to know what they want to know, and to facilitate also the visualization and understanding. So last slide, recommendations, comprehensive consideration of the case, reconciliation process, integrated technical report on identification, not dispersed, unconnected, partial reports, creation of identification units as a holder of the technical identification process, setup of information flow systems connected inter and intra-institutionally, position of identification coordinators that were proven today to be uh, very convenient when you have high scale cases, and quality control systems. Always circles, not unconnected anymore. And mathematical quantification of a match considering non-genetic variables. We really need to improve the capacity of the measure of certainty. We need mathematicians. And a challenge is the need for better reference databases for non-genetic variables. We don't have good databases in the pathology, in the prevalence of diseases, in different dental works that are more frequent in a population. We cannot refer to frequency because our reference databases doesn't exist most in most countries, and need to further improvement and application of these complex models to the search and the identification of missing persons. Thank you very much.